The load chart on a Liebherr 550 ECH is not a suggestion. It is a mathematical absolute, a rigid contract between gravity, steel, and the hydraulic pressure keeping you alive. If the chart says you can take 4 tons at the 60-meter radius, you do not take 4 tons and a loose chain. You respect the physics, or the physics will tear the tower apart and drop you 600 feet into the rebar forest below. My name is Miller. For the last 8 months, I have lived my life inside a plexiglass box suspended 60 stories above the unfinished skeleton of the Atlas Plaza. I am a crane operator. I sit in the sky, detached from the sweating, shouting ants on the pour decks below, moving steel beams and pallets of concrete block with the flick of a joystick. It is a job of isolation and precision. You learn to trust the vibration of the slewing ring under your seat more than you trust the voice of the rigger on the radio. You learn that the wind is a living thing that wants to kill you, and you learn that from up here, the city looks like a circuit board, organized, flowing, and fragile. That morning, the circuit board was humming with the usual Tuesday friction. I was tracking the wind speed on the anemometer display, 12 miles per hour, gusting to 18. Manageable. The load moment indicator, LMI, screen showed a steady green bar as I slewed left, bringing the jib over the loading zone on the street level. Tower 1, this is ground. We got that bundle of number 8 rebar ready for the lift. Slings are set. Take up the slack. The voice in my earpiece was indistinct, buried under a layer of static that had been getting worse all morning. I keyed the mic. Copy ground. Trolleying out. Watch the swing. I nudged the left joystick forward. The trolley motor whined, a high-pitched mechanical keen that vibrated through the floor of the cab. 80 meters out on the jib, the trolley rolled along the rails, carrying the heavy hook block. I watched the cable drum spin through the glass floor panel between my boots. The wire rope paid out smooth and greased, a silver thread connecting me to the pavement. Routine is a sedative. Your hands do the work while your mind drifts. I lined up the block, lowered the hook, and watched the tiny figures in high-vis vests swarm it. They hooked the nylon slings, stepped back, and gave the hand signal. Thumb up. Hoist. I pulled back on the right stick. The diesel generator behind the cab roared, taking the load. The cables tightened, snapping straight. The LMI jumped to 3.5 tons. The crane bowed slightly, the steel structure flexing like a fishing rod. It's a feeling you never quite get used to, the entire tower leaning forward into the void. I swung the load toward the 45th floor, where the concrete crew was waiting. That was when I noticed the traffic. Usually at 10 a.m., the flow on 4th Avenue is steady but moving. Delivery trucks, taxis, the black sedans of the financial district. But today, the artery was clogged. It was not just a red light backup. The cars were skewed, nose to tail at odd angles, crossing the lane dividers. It looked like the blood flow to the city's heart had hit a clot. Tower 1, hold the swing! Hold! The rigger's voice cracked in my ear, sharp and panicked. I centered the joystick instantly. The hydraulic brakes engaged with a heavy clunk, and the 3-ton bundle of rebar swung gently in the air, 50 feet above the deck. Holding, I said. What's the issue, ground? No answer. Just the open channel hiss, punctuated by a sound that did not belong on a construction site. Screaming. Not the sharp shout of a man who smashed his thumb, but a collective, rising wail, like a stadium crowd reacting to a bad foul, but pitched higher. I leaned forward, pressing my forehead against the cold glass of the front windshield. Down on the street, the loading zone was dissolving. The riggers who had just hooked my load were running. They were not running toward the brake trailer.
They were scrambling over the Jersey barriers, abandoning their hard hats, sprinting into the gridlock of 4th Avenue. A delivery truck, a boxy white step van, had jumped the curb and plowed into the site fencing. Steam hissed from its radiator. The driver's door was open. "Ground, this is Tower 1. Talk to me. Is the site compromised?"
Silence. I looked at the 45th floor. The concrete crew was gone. The rebar bundle hung suspended in space, casting a long, thin shadow over the empty gray slab. Then I saw the first wave. It poured out of the subway entrance 2 blocks east. From this height, they did not look like people. They looked like a fluid, a dark, chaotic spill spreading rapidly through the stalled cars. They moved fast, jerky and erratic, swarming around the vehicles. I saw a driver's door open on a stalled sedan. A figure tried to get out. The dark fluid washed over him. He did not get up. My phone buzzed on the console. It was the site foreman, Kowalski. "Miller, shut it down. Get your ass to the buck hoist." "Kowalski, what's happening? I've got a load in the air." "Drop the damn load. Just drop it. They're inside the perimeter. The gate is gone. Get down here now." The line went dead. I looked at the rebar bundle swaying gently in the wind. 3.5 tons of steel. If I dropped it now, it would crash through the formwork on the 45th floor, likely punching through to the 44th. But I could not leave it hanging. A suspended load is a battery of potential energy waiting to kill someone. Habit took over. I slewed the crane right, aiming for the designated dump zone, a clear patch of dirt near the foundation pit. I trolleyed in fast, ignoring the sway, and slammed the hoist stick forward. The cable drum screamed as the load plummeted. I caught it 10 feet off the ground, stabilized it for a split second, and set it down. The tension went out of the cables. The crane sprang back, the tower rebounding upright. I killed the engines. The sudden silence in the cab was deafening. The wind whistled through the grate on the floor. I grabbed my backpack, my radio, and my heavy wrench and kicked the cab door open. The air hit me, cold, smelling of ozone and wet concrete. I stepped out onto the catwalk. The view was panoramic and terrifying. Smoke was rising from 3 different spots in the financial district. The sound of sirens was a constant, dissonant drone, weaving together into a blanket of noise that covered the city. I ran along the counterjib toward the tower mast. The Liebherr 550 is a top slewing crane. To get down, you have to climb down the center of the mast sections, a vertical tunnel of steel lattice. It's a 600-foot descent on a ladder. I hit the turntable and swung into the ladder well. My boots rang on the galvanized rungs. I slid down the first 20 feet, hitting the first rest platform. I looked through the grating. The buck hoist, the external construction elevator attached to the side of the building, was usually a slow, rattling cage. Now, it was a lifeboat on the Titanic. Even from here, I could see the crush at the base. Hundreds of workers were pressing against the chain-link enclosure. The cage was ascending, overloaded, grinding slowly up the rails. But the base was not holding. I saw the fence buckle. The mob from the street, the infected, the panicked, the violent, surged into the site. They hit the back of the crowd waiting for the elevator like a hammer. I stopped. The ladder below me vibrated. Someone was climbing up. Not the elevator, the crane tower itself. I leaned over the railing of the platform. About 100 feet down, inside the lattice of the tower, a figure was scrambling up the rungs. He was not wearing a harness. He was moving with a desperate, frantic energy, missing rungs, slipping, hauling himself up by his arms. He was not a worker. He was wearing a torn suit jacket. "Hey!" I shouted. "Stay off the tower! This is a restricted area!"
He looked up. His face was a mask of blood. His mouth was open in a silent scream, or maybe a snarl. He did not stop. He did not even pause. He kept climbing, hand over hand, his eyes fixed on me with a blank, predatory focus. Behind him, 2 more figures entered the base of the tower. Then 5. The realization hit me in the gut like a swinging headache ball. They were not climbing to escape. They were climbing because they saw movement. They were climbing to feed. The ground was gone. The building was a trap. The elevator was a coffin. I looked up. Above me, the white cab of the crane gleamed in the sun. The turntable, the machinery deck,
The counterweights. It was an island of steel in the sky. I did not think about it. I reversed direction. The climb up is always harder than the climb down, but adrenaline is a hell of a fuel. I hauled myself up the rungs, my breath tearing at my throat. The vertical tunnel felt like it was closing in. I could hear the clang of the climbers below me, a discordant rhythm of boots and hands slapping against metal. They were fast. Faster than a human should be on a vertical ladder without safety gear. I reached the slewing ring, the massive gear that connects the stationary tower to the rotating upper machinery. I scrambled through the access hatch and onto the machinery deck. I slammed the heavy steel trapdoor shut. It did not lock. Cranes are not designed to keep people out from the inside. The trapdoor was just a heavy grate to prevent operators from falling down the hole. It sat in a recessed frame, held by gravity. I heard the first climber hit the section below the slewing ring. He was maybe 30 seconds behind me. I looked around the machinery deck frantically. It was a narrow catwalk surrounding the massive winch drums and the diesel engine. Grease buckets, a toolbox, a fire extinguisher. I grabbed the fire extinguisher, a heavy 20-pound CO2 canister, and dragged it over the trapdoor. It was not enough weight. If 3 or 4 of them pushed from below, they'd lift it. I needed leverage. I spotted a stack of steel shims, heavy plates used for leveling the track rollers, bolted to a storage rack near the engine. I needed a wrench. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for the crescent wrench on my belt. I spun the nut, fighting the urge to look at the grate. Clang! A hand struck the underside of the trapdoor. Gray fingers, skin torn to ribbons, hooked through the mesh. I yelled, a guttural sound of panic, and stomped on the fingers with my steel-toed boot. There was a wet crunch. The fingers retracted, but the grate lifted an inch, then slammed back down. I got the first shim loose. It weighed 50 pounds. I dragged it over and dropped it onto the corner of the grate. The trapdoor jumped again. The climber was throwing his entire body weight against it. "Back off!" I screamed, knowing it was useless. I needed to jam it. I looked at the hinges. They were simple barrel hinges welded to the deck. If I could wedge something into the frame. I saw a pry bar leaning against the hydraulic reservoir. I grabbed it. The next time the grate lifted, I jammed the tapered end of the pry bar between the frame and the grate, leveraging it down. But I could not hold it forever. I looked at the slewing motors. There were 4 of them, massive electric motors that rotated the crane. They were bolted to the deck with high tensile bolts. I ran to the toolbox. I grabbed a heavy ratchet strap, a 2-inch wide yellow webbing rated for 5,000 pounds. I ran back to the trapdoor. I hooked one end of the strap to the grating of the trapdoor itself. I looped the other end around the heavy steel mounting bracket of the slewing motor. I cranked the ratchet. Click, click, click. The webbing pulled tight. The trapdoor groaned, pulled hard against the frame. Beneath me, the climber slammed into the grate again. The strap vibrated, humming like a guitar string. But it held.
He hit it again. And again. The steel mesh bowed slightly, but the ratchet held the door down. I collapsed back against the engine housing, gasping for air. My lungs burned. I stared at the yellow strap, watching it twitch with every impact from below. After 10 minutes, the banging stopped. I did not move. I sat there on the cold diamond plate steel, listening to the wind and the distant sirens. I was 300 feet above the street, trapped on a piece of machinery 10 feet wide and 40 feet long. I crawled to the edge of the machinery deck and looked over the side. The tower of the crane was crawling with them. Dozens of figures clung to the lattice work like ants on a stem of grass. Some had fallen. I saw the smears on the concrete counterweights of the floors below. But the one at the top, he was still there. He was clinging to the ladder right under the trapdoor, waiting. I was not going down. Not today.
Maybe not ever. I stood up, my legs feeling like rubber, and walked back to the operator's cab. I stepped inside and closed the weather-sealed door. The latch clicked, a solid, mechanical sound that felt ridiculously insufficient. I sat in the operator's seat. The leather was still warm from my shift. The monitors were still glowing. The anemometer read 14 miles per hour. The fuel gauge for the generator read 3/4 full. I looked out the front windshield. The sun was high and bright, indifferent to the smoke rising from the city. The Atlas Plaza construction site was a graveyard. The buck hoist had stalled halfway up the building, a cage full of silence. I was the highest living thing in the city. My eyes scanned the cab. I needed to take inventory. Survival is an accounting problem. Calories in, calories out. BTUs of heat, liters of water. I had my lunch cooler. Inside, 1 turkey sandwich, an apple, a bag of chips, and 2 bottles of water. I had a thermos of coffee, now lukewarm. I had a pack of gum. I looked at the space behind the seat. There was a gallon jug of windshield washer fluid, methanol mix, poison. A roll of paper towels, a spray bottle of glass cleaner, a first aid kit, basic, Band-Aids and aspirin. That was it. My gaze drifted to the LMI screen. The crane was still live. The generator was idling, burning diesel. If the generator ran out of fuel, the heaters would die. The hydraulic pumps would stop. The crane would become a dead stick. And then the batteries would drain, and I'd lose the radio and the lights. I checked the fuel tank capacity on the digital readout. 400 liters remaining. At idle, the Liebherr burns maybe 5 liters an hour. Under load, 20. If I killed the engine now, I'd freeze tonight. The temperature at this altitude drops fast. But if I left it running, I had 3, maybe 4 days of power. I reached out and turned the key. The roar of the diesel engine behind the cab died. The vibration stopped. The silence rushed in, filling the cab, pressing against the glass. I was alone. The sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long, bloody shadows across the gridlock below. The city lights usually flickered on around this time, a galaxy of artificial stars. Tonight, the grid was failing. Sections of the city went dark in massive, rectangular blocks. The traffic lights were dead. The only illumination came from the headlights of stalled cars and the fires burning uncontrolled in the distance. I wrapped my high-visibility jacket tighter around myself. The cold was already seeping through the floor. I needed a plan. The trapdoor was secured with a single strap. The lattice tower was climbable. The cold was coming. I had food for a day, water for a day. But I had something else.
I looked at the joysticks. I had a machine capable of lifting 20 tons. I had a 500-foot reach.
I had a trolley that could move anywhere within a 60-meter radius. The unfinished building next to me, the skeletal floors of the Atlas Plaza, was filled with materials. Pallets of drywall, bundles of insulation, crates of tools, water coolers, portable toilets. I was not just stuck in a box. I was the pilot of the biggest claw machine in the world, and the prizes were scattered all over the deck below. But first, I had to survive the night. I leaned back in the seat and watched the trapdoor monitor, a small CCTV feed showing the underside of the machinery deck. The camera was grainy, night vision green. Through the mesh of the trapdoor, I could see a hand. It was still there, holding the rung, waiting. I closed my eyes, but I did not sleep. I listened to the wind singing through the steel lattice, a mournful, high-pitched hum that would become the soundtrack of my life. The world had ended. The job had just begun. Cold is a patient killer. It does not scream like the things climbing the tower, and it does not rush you. It just waits until you stop moving. Then it subtracts the heat from your blood 1 joule at a time. I woke up because my teeth were chattering hard enough to bite my tongue. The sun was up, but it offered no warmth, just a harsh, angled glare that bounced off the glass walls of my cage. The condensation from my breath had frozen on the inside of the windows, forming a delicate, opaque lace that obscured the world below. I sat up, my joints popping like dry twigs. The temperature gauge on the console read -4 degrees Celsius. Inside the cab, I checked the trapdoor monitor first. The screen was fuzzy with static, but the shape was still there. The hand was gone from the mesh, but a dark slump of rags lay wedged on the ladder landing just below the slewing ring. It was waiting, dormant, conserving energy. Just like me. I rubbed my hands together, feeling the friction of dry skin on dry skin. My water bottles were slush. I tucked one inside my jacket, against my ribs, hoping my body heat would melt it enough to drink. I had to pee. That was a logistical problem. Usually you use a bottle, or, if you're desperate, you climb down to the porta-john on the ground. Neither was an option. I found the empty windshield washer jug I'd spotted yesterday. It still had a few dregs of blue methanol in the bottom. I swirled it, dumped the toxic slush out the door crack, and used the jug. The relief was instant, but the heat loss was tangible. I sealed the jug and set it in the corner. I was not going to throw it away. Heat is heat, even if it comes from waste. That's the first rule of thermodynamics in a survival situation. Entropy is the enemy. I needed to secure the thermal envelope. The cab of a Liebherr 550 is designed for visibility, not insulation. It's a greenhouse in the summer and a freezer in the winter. The glass is single-pane tempered safety glass. It has an R value of basically 0. If I did not fix that, I'd be dead of hypothermia within 48 hours, regardless of food or water. I needed materials. I stood up and stepped out onto the machinery deck, moving slowly to keep my heart rate low. The wind hit me instantly, cutting through my high-vis jacket like a razor. The air smelled of wood smoke and rotting garbage, the scent of a city that had stopped taking out its trash. I walked the perimeter of the deck, cataloging every loose ounce of steel and plastic. Item 1. A 55-gallon drum of hydraulic fluid, half full. Useful for fuel, maybe, but hard to burn cleanly. Item 2. The tool chest. A heavy red steel box bolted to the deck. I popped the latch. Inside was the standard maintenance loadout,
a set of oversized combination wrenches up to 50 millimeters, a sledgehammer, a pry bar, a grease gun, and thank God, a cordless angle grinder with 2 spare batteries and a stack of cutting discs. Item 3. The dunnage pile. A small stack of 4x4 timber blocks used to support the counter jib during assembly. Item 4. A coil of 8-gauge steel wire, left over from securing the aviation warning lights. I looked over the railing at the building below. The 45th floor, the pour deck, was a chaotic landscape of abandoned construction materials. My eyes scanned the gray concrete slab, filtering out the garbage, looking for gold. There.
Near the south edge, strapped to a pallet, was a stack of Dow styrofoam insulation boards. 4-inch thick, rigid blue extruded polystyrene, R20 per sheet. A treasure chest of trapped air. Next to it, a pallet of heavy-duty shrink-wrap rolls. If I could get that foam, I could line the interior of the cab. I could turn the glass box into a thermos. But the hook block hanging from the tip of my jib was a dumb tool. It was a massive steel weight with a forged hook, designed to catch nylon slings placed by human hands. It could not grab. It could not pinch. Without a rigger down there to choke the load, the crane was useless. I needed a hand made of steel that I could operate from 300 feet away. I looked at the tool chest again. I looked at the scrap wire. I looked at the dunnage. I dragged the heavy tool chest into the lee of the generator housing to block the wind. It was time to build. To pick up a pallet without rigging, you need a friction grip or a gravity toggle. I did not have the materials for a complex toggle mechanism. I had to go primitive. I needed a grapple, something that could drag and snag. I pulled the spare angle grinder from the case. The battery indicator showed 2 out of 3 bars. I had maybe 20 minutes of cut time. I could not waste a second. I took 3 of the largest combination wrenches from the set, the 46mm, the 48mm, and the 50mm. They were chrome vanadium steel, drop forged, incredibly hard. I did not want to sacrifice them, but they were the only long, rigid steel bars I had. I clamped the 50mm wrench into the vice grip on the side of the generator housing. I marked a cut line across the open-ended jaw. I needed to turn the U shape of the wrench jaw into a sharp barb. I triggered the grinder. The disc spun up with a high-pitched whine. I touched it to the steel. Sparks showered my lap, bright orange and stinging. The smell of hot ozone and grinding metal filled the cold air. The steel fought back. This was tool-grade alloy, not mild structural iron. I had to apply steady pressure, letting the abrasive do the work, careful not to shatter the disc. It took 6 minutes to cut the first barb. When I was done, the handle of the wrench ended in a jagged, sharp-tooth point. I repeated the process for the other 2 wrenches. My hands were vibrating from the tool's torque, numbness creeping up my forearms. Now I had 3 hardened steel talons. I needed a central hub. I went to the cable drum. The main hoist cable is terminated with a wedge socket, a heavy steel casting where the wire rope loops back on itself. Above the hook block, there's usually a shackle point for auxiliary lines. I found a spare 8 and 5-ton shackle in the bottom of the toolbox. The pin was rusted fast. I doused it with penetrating oil and hammered it with the sledge until it broke free. The assembly process was crude. I took the dunnage, a solid block of hardwood, 4 by 4 inches thick. I drilled a hole through the center using the largest bit I had, turning the drill brace by hand until my shoulders burned. I passed the shackle bolt through the wood. Then, I arranged the 3 sharpened wrenches around the wood block, pointing down and inward, like a claw. I used the 8-gauge steel wire to lash them in place. I wrapped the wire tight, layer over layer.
using the pry bar to twist the ends until the wire bit into the wood and the steel handles. It was not enough. The wire would stretch. The wrenches would shift under load. I needed a keeper. I took the steel shims I had used to weigh down the trap door. I stole one back, listening carefully for any movement from the ladder. Silence. I dragged the shim over. I cut it into 3 small strips with the last of the grinder battery. I positioned the strips across the wrench handles and drove heavy lag screws, scavenged from the timber blocking, through the metal and into the wood. I cranked them down until the washer heads buried themselves in the steel. The result was ugly. It looked like a medieval torture device, a block of wood bristling with chrome steel talons wrapped in wire and bolted together. But it was heavy, and the points were sharp. I dragged the monstrosity to the edge of the deck. I had to attach it to the hook. This was the dangerous part.
To rig the hook, I had to climb out onto the machinery deck railing, lean out over the void, and grab the hoist block. I put on my harness. I clipped the lanyard to the railing. I leaned out. The wind roared in my ears. The city spun beneath me. I grabbed the cold steel of the headache ball and pulled it close. It swayed, heavy and indifferent. I unpinned the standard safety latch on the hook and slid my improvised grapple onto the main hook, securing it with the shackle. It hung there, spinning slowly. A 3-fingered claw. I scrambled back into the cab, my fingers stiff and clumsy. I slammed the door. Time to fish. I turned the ignition key. The diesel engine coughed, sputtered, and roared to life. The vibration was comforting, a heartbeat returning to a dead body. I checked the fuel gauge. I had burned the startup cost. Now I had to make it worth it. I disengaged the swing brake. I pushed the left stick. The crane groaned as it rotated. I watched the grapple swing out over the abyss. I trolleyed out to the 45-meter radius. I looked down through the floor window. The pallet of insulation was a tiny blue square, 600 feet down. "Easy, Miller. Easy," I whispered. I lowered the hook. The cable drum spun. The grapple descended, shrinking as it went. This was not like pouring concrete. Concrete buckets are heavy and stable. This grapple was light, and the wind was gusting. It danced around, swinging in a 20-foot arc. I had to time the pendulum. I watched the sway. Left, right, left, drop. I pushed the hoist stick forward. The grapple plummeted. I caught it just before it hit the deck, arresting the fall. It hovered 10 feet above the pallet. Now came the finesse. I had to drag the grapple across the pallet so the wrench barbs would snag the nylon straps holding the foam sheets together. I lowered the hook until the grapple lay on its side on the concrete next to the pallet. I trolleyed in slowly, dragging the claw. It scraped across the concrete. I could imagine the sound, a harsh screech lost in the wind. The claws missed the pallet. I hoisted up, swung left, and tried again. Drag, miss, drag, miss. My hands were sweating inside my gloves. Every minute of engine time was fuel I could not get back. Fourth try. I dropped the grapple directly on top of the insulation. The sharp wrench points bit into the blue foam. Do not tear it. Do not shred it. I trolleyed out slowly, dragging the heavy claw across the top of the stack. One of the wrench jaws caught the heavy plastic strapping band. I saw the band pull tight. The pallet shifted. Gotcha. I pulled back gently on the hoist. The grapple rotated, the hooks digging in deeper, tangling in the straps. I applied tension. The cable went taut. The LMI read 0. 2 tons.
I increased the power. The pallet lifted off the ground.
It swung wildly, spinning in the wind. A sheet of foam broke loose and fluttered away like a giant blue leaf, disappearing into the city below. Steady. I hoisted fast now, wanting to get it out of the turbulent air near the building. The blue brick rose through the sky. I brought it up to cab level. I slewed the crane until the pallet was hovering directly over the machinery deck. I lowered it gently. It touched down on the grating with a soft thud. I killed the engine immediately. I sat there for a moment, listening to the silence return. I had the raw materials. Now I had to build the shelter. I spent the next 4 hours turning my glass cage into a padded cell. I dragged the foam sheets into the cab one by one. I used the utility knife from the toolbox to score and snap the rigid insulation. The sound was a squeaky, friction-heavy noise that set my teeth on edge, but the material was perfect. I started with the floor. The steel grating sucked heat out of my boots instantly. I laid a double layer of 4-inch foam over the entire floor area, cutting holes for the pedals and the floor window. I saved the cutouts to use as plugs. Next, the rear wall behind the seat. I jammed the panels tight against the metal frame, friction fitting them. I used duct tape, half a roll found in the maintenance kit, to seal the seams. Then the side windows. I covered the lower halves completely, leaving only a strip at the top for visibility. I created a shutter system for the front windshield, a panel of foam I could slide into place at night and remove during the day to let the sun in. It was like building a fort out of sofa cushions, but the stakes were life and death. As I worked, the change in acoustics was the first thing I noticed. The hollow, tinny echo of the cab disappeared, replaced by a dead, muffled silence. The wind noise outside became a distant, dull roar. I finished the last panel as the sun began to set. I sat in the operator's seat. The cab was now a blue cave. The only light came from the instrument cluster and the dying gray light filtering through my view slits. I looked at the thermometer. It had been -4 degrees Celsius when I started. It was now +2 degrees Celsius. It was not a tropical vacation, but it was above freezing. My body heat, trapped inside the high-efficiency foam box, was slowly warming the air volume. I was not done. I took the roll of shrink wrap I had snagged. It had been tangled in the pallet straps. I scrunched a massive ball of the plastic film into a loose, airy mass and stuffed it into the gap between the seat and the back wall. It acted like fiberglass batting, dead airspace. I unwrapped my sandwich. The bread was stale and hard, but the turkey was not frozen anymore. I ate it slowly, chewing every bite to a paste to extract maximum energy. I took a sip of water. Liquid. I leaned back in the seat, surrounded by my blue walls. I felt like an astronaut in the capsule, or a pharaoh in a tomb. Then a sound cut through my muffled sanctuary. Thump. It came from below. Not the wind, not the settling of steel. Thump. Thump. I froze. I looked at the trapdoor monitor. The dark pile of rags on the landing was moving. It was standing up, and behind it, another shape was pulling itself up the ladder. The cold had not killed them. It had just slowed them down. And now, attracted by the noise of the engine or the vibration of the grinder, they were waking up. I looked at the ratchet strap holding the trapdoor. It was tight, but the thing below was not just banging on the grate anymore. I heard the distinct metallic scritch of something sharp testing the gap between the door and the frame. I reached for the wrench, the one I had not cut apart. My insulation was done. My water was liquid. But the fortress had a gate, and the barbarians were testing the hinges.
I needed a weapon, and I needed it before they figured out how to undo a ratchet strap. The wind did not arrive as a gust. It arrived as a localized atmospheric pressure drop that I could feel in my sinuses before I saw it on the instruments. The sky to the north, previously a flat, bruised purple, turned a color that does not exist in nature, a bioluminescent, sickly white, like the belly of a dead fish. I was sitting in my foam-lined sarcophagus, watching the anemometer. The digital readout flickered. 25 miles per hour.
Then 35. Then 48. The Liebherr 550 ECH is rated for operation up to 45 miles per hour. Above that, you shut down. Above 70 miles per hour, you enter the survival rating zone, but only if the crane is properly configured. The cardinal rule of tower crane survival in a storm is weather vaning. You must release the slewing brakes. You have to let the massive jib swing freely like a giant compass needle, pointing the nose of the crane into the wind. If the brakes are locked, the jib acts like a sail. The wind pushes against the side of the steel structure, creating massive torsional stress on the mast. If the torque exceeds the rating of the bolts connecting the tower sections, the heads shear off. The tower folds, and I ride the white cab down 60 stories into the concrete grave of the Atlas Plaza. I hit the free slew button on the console. A yellow light usually illuminates to confirm the hydraulic brakes on the swing motors have disengaged. The light stayed dark. I pressed it again. Nothing. I looked at the pressure gauge for the slewing hydraulic circuit. 0 psi. The cold. The generator had been off for 12 hours to save fuel. The hydraulic fluid in the lines, viscous oil that turns to molasses in sub-zero temperatures, had thickened. Or worse, a seal had cracked in the freeze-thaw cycle, and the fluid had bled out onto the machinery deck. The tower groaned. It was not the usual rhythmic creaking of steel under load. It was a deep, resonant moan that vibrated through the floor plates and up my spine. The entire cab listed 5 degrees to the left as a gust hammered the side of the counter jib. I looked at the torque monitor. The bar graph was in the orange. The crane was locked perpendicular to the wind. It was fighting a hurricane, and it was losing. I had to release those brakes manually. The manual release levers were located on the slew motors themselves, on the machinery deck. Outside, I looked at the CCTV monitor. The trapdoor feed was dark. The camera lens had iced over or the connection had failed. But I could hear them. The thumping had changed. It was not the rhythmic banging of a fist anymore. It was the grinding, metal-on-metal screech of leverage. They had found tools, or they were using the bones of the ones who came before them. I did not have a choice. The math was binary. Stay inside and wait for the tower to snap, or go outside and risk the breach. I prepared for EVA. I zipped my high-vis jacket to the throat, pulling the collar up over my ears. I put on my hard hat, tightening the chin strap until it dug into my jaw. I checked my harness. Leg loops tight, chest strap centered. I went to the tool chest in the corner of the cab. I grabbed the 3-pound sledgehammer and the pry bar. Then I grabbed the gallon jug of methanol I had been using as a latrine. It was a disgusting, desperate weapon. But chemical burns are psychological warfare, even against the dead. I cracked the weather door. The pressure differential sucked the air out of the cab with a whistle. I stepped out. The wind hit me like a physical blow, a solid wall of freezing air moving at 60 miles per hour. It nearly knocked me off the catwalk. I grabbed the handrail with a death grip, clipping my lanyard to the safety line before I took a second step. The noise was deafening.
The wind screamed through the lattice of the tower and the counter jib, creating a harmonic resonance that sounded like a jet engine at takeoff. I crouched low, keeping my center of gravity down, and Crab walked toward the slewing ring. There are 4 slewing motors on the Liebherr 550, arranged in a circle around the mast. To weather vane the crane, I had to disengage at least 3 of them to allow the gears to slip. I reached the first motor. It was a heavy, gray block of cast iron bolted to the deck. The manual release was a small lever protected by a pin. I pulled the pin. My fingers were numb inside my gloves. I yanked the lever. Clunk. The brake pads retracted. 1 down. I moved to the second motor. The wind gusted, pushing me hard against the generator housing. The tower swayed violently, a sickening lurch that made the horizon dip and roll. I swallowed the bile rising in my throat and pulled the second lever. Clunk. 2 down.
The crane did not move yet. The friction of the remaining 2 brakes was holding it against the wind load. I crawled toward the third motor. It was located right next to the trapdoor. I stopped. The ratchet strap I had rigged was frayed. The yellow webbing was sawed halfway through where it rubbed against the sharp edge of the steel grating. Beneath it, the trapdoor was heaving. It rose an inch, then slammed down, then rose again. Through the gap, I saw fingers. Not the gray, desiccated fingers of the first climber. These were fresh. Red, swollen, frantic. And I saw the tip of a pry bar, a piece of rebar, actually, jammed into the mesh. They were working it together. A hive mind of hunger. I was 3 feet away. If that strap snapped while I was working the brake lever, they would be on me before I could stand up. I gripped the sledgehammer. I timed the heave of the door. Up, down, up, now. I swung the hammer in a tight, downward arc, aiming for the fingers hooked through the mesh. The steel head connected with a wet, crunching impact. I did not hear a scream. The wind stole it, but the fingers vanished instantly. The rebar clattered down the ladder well. I did not wait. I lunged for the third motor. I yanked the pin. I pulled the lever. The lever was stuck. Frozen. "Come on, you piece of junk!" I screamed into the gale. I hammered the lever with the heel of my hand. Nothing. I wedged the pry bar behind it and leaned in. Snap. The lever broke off in my hand. The brake remained engaged. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded my chest. If I could not release this brake and the fourth one, the crane would not spin. The torque would kill us all. I looked at the fourth motor. It was on the far side of the trapdoor. To get to it, I had to step over the hatch. The strap was holding by a few threads. The yellow webbing was stretched taut, singing a high-pitched note in the wind. I checked my tether. It was clipped to the outer railing. If the door opened and they grabbed my legs, the harness would hold me, but they'd drag me down to the grate. They'd chew my boots off. Then my feet. I needed to reinforce the door, but I did not have another strap. I looked at the slewing ring gears, massive, grease-covered teeth exposed at the inner edge of the deck. I had an idea. A terrible, reckless idea. If I could not release the brakes, I had to overpower them. I crawled back to the generator. I checked the fuel. It was low, but enough. I hit the start button. The diesel engine cranked. Chug, chug, chug. It did not catch. The glow plugs were cold. "Start, damn you!" I hit it again. The starter motor whined. A puff of black smoke erupted from the exhaust stack,
whipped away instantly by the wind. The engine roared to life. I scrambled back to the cab. I threw myself into the seat and slammed the door. The torque monitor was in the red.
Critical structural stress. The warning buzzer was blaring. I grabbed the left joystick, the swing control. Usually, you never fight the brakes. If the brakes are locked and you apply power, you burn out the motors or strip the gearbox. But I had 2 brakes open and 2 locked. I had half the friction, and I had the wind helping me. The wind was hitting the jib from the left. It wanted to push the crane clockwise. I jammed the joystick hard right, clockwise. I was adding the torque of the electric motors to the force of the wind, trying to break the static friction of the frozen brake pads. The crane shuddered. The electric motors whined, a pitch that rose until it was painful. The floor plates vibrated. Come on, break loose. On the CCTV monitor, I saw the trapdoor. The vibration was doing what the infected could not. The oscillation of the deck was sawing through the last threads of the ratchet strap. Ping! The strap snapped. The trapdoor flew open. A figure erupted from the hole. It did not climb. It vaulted, driven by the pressure of bodies behind it. It was a man in a torn safety vest, his face a ruin of frostbite and trauma. He landed on the machinery deck on all fours, slipping on the ice. He saw the cab. He saw me. He scrambled forward, claws scrabbling on the steel. Behind him, a second head appeared. I was trapped in the glass box. If he reached the door, he could smash the glass. I did not let off the joystick. I pushed it harder, as if pressing the plastic stick through the console would give me more amps. Crack! A sound like a gunshot rang out from the machinery deck. The 2 frozen brakes did not release. They shattered. The pads disintegrated under the massive combined load of the wind and the motors. The crane lurched. With the friction gone, the wind took over. The jib, a 200-foot lever arm catching a 60-mile-per-hour gale, accelerated instantly. The entire superstructure spun clockwise. It was not the slow, graceful rotation of a controlled lift. It was a violent, whipping spin. The acceleration threw me sideways against the foam-padded wall. On the machinery deck, the physics were even more brutal. The first infected, the one on all fours, was halfway to the cab. When the deck whipped around, inertia took over. The deck moved out from under him. He slid sideways, his fingernails sparking against the diamond plate. He grasped for the railing, but the centrifugal force combined with the sudden lateral jerk was too much. He flew off the edge of the deck. I did not see him fall. He just vanished into the white void of the storm. The second one, still halfway out of the hatch, got it worse. The hatch frame was moving with the deck. The ladder and the climber were attached to the mast, which was stationary relative to the rotation. As the crane spun, the heavy steel edge of the trapdoor frame acted like a guillotine. It scissored across the opening. The climber was sheared in half at the waist. The torso tumbled onto the deck, writhing. The legs fell back down the ladder well, knocking the climbers below into the darkness. The crane continued to spin, faster now, seeking the path of least resistance. I centered the joystick, killing the power, but the momentum carried us. We did a full 360 rotation before the jib finally aligned with the wind. The crane settled, rocking gently, nose to the storm. The groaning of the tower stopped. The torque alarm went silent. We were weather-vaned. I sat there, breathing hard, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I looked at the monitor. The upper half of the climber was dragging itself across the machinery deck. It had no legs, trailing a smear of dark, frozen ichor.
It was still crawling toward the cab. The trap door was open. The rotation had cleared the immediate blockage, but the hole was gaping. The wind was howling down into the ladder well, and more of them could be coming. I had to go back out. I grabbed the methanol jug and the sledgehammer. I stepped out onto the catwalk. The wind was still fierce, but now that the crane was aligned, the turbulence was less violent on the deck itself. I walked over to the crawler. It hissed at me, snapping its teeth. I did not hesitate. I brought the sledgehammer down on its skull. One swing. Clean. I kicked the remains off the deck.
I moved to the open hatch. I shined my headlamp down into the hole. The ladder well was a mess. The falling legs and the body I had knocked down had created a cascade effect. I could see a tangle of limbs jammed in the lattice work about 20 feet down. Nothing was moving. The guillotine effect had likely terrified or crushed the ones immediately below. But I could not trust it. I grabbed the heavy steel trapdoor. It was bent slightly from the force of the shear, but it would still close. I slammed it down. The ratchet strap was useless. I needed a permanent lock. I looked around. The wind was whipping the loose end of the broken strap. I saw the spill kit barrel, the drum of hydraulic fluid. It weighed 400 pounds. I could not lift it. But the deck was slick with ice. I braced my back against the generator housing and pushed the drum with my legs. It slid, screeching across the metal. I lined it up. I pushed it directly onto the trapdoor. It settled with a heavy metallic thud, covering the grate completely. I stood there for a moment, staring at the drum. 400 pounds of oil. Gravity was the only lock I had left. I turned back to the cab. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely open the door. Inside, the temperature had dropped. The wind had sucked out a lot of my heat during the EVA. I sat in the chair and wrapped my arms around myself. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a cold, hollow exhaustion. I checked the fuel gauge. The hard start and the max power spin had drained the tank. I had maybe 10 liters left. The storm was raging outside, a whiteout that erased the world. The crane was swinging gently left and right, hunting the wind, doing exactly what it was designed to do. I had survived the breach. I had survived the torque. But as I looked at the fuel gauge, I realized the math had changed. I had cleared the immediate threat, but I had burned my future to do it. 10 liters. That was 20 hours of heat, maybe less. After that, the cold would not wait outside anymore. It would come in, and it would stay. I looked at the grapple I had built, the wooden block with the wrench claws. It was sitting in the corner where I had stashed it. The city below was buried in snow. The pallets of supplies were gone, covered in white drifts. I was the master of the tower, but the tower was a tomb. I closed my eyes and listened to the wind. It sounded different now. It did not sound like an enemy. It sounded like a clock. Tick, tock. I needed a new source of heat, or I needed to leave. And looking at the blocked trapdoor, I knew leaving was not an option. The way down was choked with the dead. The only way was up or out. I pulled the insulated shutter over the windshield, plunging the cab into darkness. I lit the small LED lantern. It was time to inventory the trash again. I needed to build a stove, and I had to do it inside a plastic-lined box without suffocating myself. The engineer in me woke up. Problem: heat generation. Constraint: ventilation. Resources: hydraulic oil, steel bucket, copper tubing from the AC unit, 12-volt fan. I pulled out my notepad. My hand trembled as I drew the first schematic. Figure 1. Waste oil burner with forced induction. I was not done yet. The death of the generator was not a sudden event. It did not cough or sputter. It simply completed its final revolution and stopped, obeying the laws of combustion as strictly as it had obeyed the laws of torque. The silence that followed was heavy, a physical weight that pressed against the foam-insulated walls of the cab. For the first time in weeks, I could hear the true sound of the city, the whistling of the wind through the rebar lattice, the distant, dry rattle of loose cladding, and the total absence of human rhythm. I sat in the dark, watching the voltage meter on the battery bank slowly tick down. 24.1 volt, 23.8 volts. When it hit 21 volts, the inverter would cut out to protect the cells. The heater was already dead. The lights were next. I had 10 liters of diesel left in the tank, the dregs I could not pump out. But I had 400 pounds of hydraulic fluid sitting in a drum on top of the trapdoor. ISO 46 viscosity, high flash point, dirty. I was not an operator anymore. I was a refinery.
The transition from diesel to waste oil was not just a matter of pouring a different liquid into a tank. A diesel engine will not run on cold hydraulic fluid. The viscosity is too high for the injectors, and the combustion temperature is all wrong. I could not run the generator. I had to bypass the engine entirely and harvest the chemical energy directly. I needed a furnace. The construction took 3 days of freezing, fumbling misery. My hands were stiff claws, the skin cracked and bleeding around the knuckles. I worked by the light of the midday sun, rationing my movement to conserve calories. The combustion chamber was the first challenge. I used the empty grease keg from the maintenance locker. It was heavy-gauge steel, capable of withstanding high heat. I used the angle grinder, powered by the last juice in the crane's battery bank, to cut a rectangular intake door near the bottom and a circular exhaust port in the lid. The carburetor was a gravity-fed drip system. I took the windshield washer reservoir, the plastic jug I had cleaned out, and mounted it high on the rear wall of the cab, screwing it directly into the foam insulation. I ran a length of scavenged copper tubing from the jug down to the stove. The nozzle was the tricky part. If the oil dripped too fast, it would flood the fire and snuff it out. If it dripped too slow, the heat would not sustain the draft. I used a pair of vice grips to crimp the copper tube, creating a primitive needle valve. I tested the flow rate with water first, 1 drop every 3 seconds. For the exhaust, I cannibalized the crane's air conditioning unit. The flexible aluminum ducting was not rated for wood stove temperatures, so I had to insulate it. I wrapped the duct in strips of fiberglass stripped from the generator housing, then bound it with wire. I cut a hole in the plexiglass floor window, the bombardier window between my feet, and ran the stack straight down. Physics dictated the rest. Hot air rises. If I could get the draft going, the smoke would be pulled down and out. No. Heat rises. Running the stack down would kill the draft. I cursed my own stupidity. Hypoxia was making me slow. I had to go up. I used the grinder to cut a hole in the roof of the cab. It felt like a violation, cutting into the weather-sealed skin of my lifeboat. I ran the duct up, sealing the gap with high-temp silicone gasket maker I found in the tool chest. The first ignition was a nerve-wracking experiment. I primed the grease keg with a handful of paper towels soaked in the precious remaining diesel. I struck a match. The paper flared. I opened the crimped copper line. Drip. A glob of golden hydraulic oil hit the flames. It sizzled, popped, and then caught. A thick, black plume of smoke erupted inside the keg.
Drip, drip.
The smoke curled around the lid, searching for an exit. Then, as the heat built up, the physics took hold. The column of hot air in the duct accelerated, creating a vacuum in the chamber. The smoke was sucked up the chimney. The fire settled into a low, guttural roar. I closed the intake door, leaving just a sliver open for oxygen. The steel sides of the grease keg began to glow a dull, cherry red. The smell was atrocious, acrid, industrial, the scent of burning rubber and old dinosaurs. But the heat was radiant. It soaked into the foam walls, into the seat, into my bones. I sat before the glowing drum, my face coated in soot, monitoring the drip rate. I was burning the blood of the machine to keep my own blood liquid. Winter settled in not as a season, but as an architectural modification to the city. The snow did not melt. It accumulated, softening the sharp edges of the skyline. The streets below, once gray canyons of asphalt, became white rivers. The cars were just bumps in the topography. My life contracted to a loop of maintenance and observation. 6:11. Wake up. The cold is usually creeping back in by now, the stove having burned down to embers. My breath hangs in the air. 6:15. Feed the beast. I climb out of the thermal envelope, the sleeping bag I fashioned from the seat covers and shrink wrap, and check the header tank. I have to refill the washer jug twice a day. This involves the most dangerous part of my routine: opening the trap door. The 55-gallon drum of oil still sits on the hatch. I drilled a hole in the bottom of it and installed a makeshift tap using a hollowed-out bolt. I do not move the drum. I just crack the valve and fill a smaller bucket, then relock the system. Every time I do this, I listen. The scratching from below has stopped. The cold has either frozen them solid or they have migrated to the warmth of the earth deep in the foundation pit. I do not know, and I do not check. 8:11. Water harvest. The roof of the cab is my catchment area. The heat from the stove melts the snow that falls on the roof. I rigged a gutter system using the plastic trim from the interior panels. The meltwater runs into a tube and into my storage bottles. It tastes of ozone and soot, but it's sterile. 12:11. The hunt. Hunger is a bored animal. It gnaws at you constantly. I had exhausted the lunch cooler in the first week. I had eaten the mints from the first aid kit. I had even tried boiling the leather from my belt, which was a disaster that cost me 2 days of stomach cramps. I needed calories. And I had a crane. The Atlas Plaza was unfinished, a skeleton of concrete. But the building next to it, the Vanguard Tower, was a finished, occupied luxury high-rise. It stood about 50 feet away from the tip of my jib. I had spent days studying the Vanguard through the binoculars I found in the foreman's desk, which I had looted before the climb. The 48th floor was a mess of shattered glass, a corner unit. I could see into the kitchen, granite countertops, stainless steel appliances, and, miraculously, a walk-in pantry with the door ajar. I could see shelves. I could see boxes. I could not swing into the apartment. The crane hook is a pendulum. It hangs plumb. I could not push it sideways into a building. Unless I swung it. It became a physics problem. I had to induce a dynamic oscillation. I spent a week practicing with a block of concrete. I would slew the crane left, then hard right, then stop. The block would swing out. I learned the timing. I learned how to pump the swing to increase the amplitude. On a Tuesday, or what I calculated was a Tuesday, I made my move. I replaced the concrete block with my grapple, the wooden block with the wrench claws.
I added a new feature, a heavy net made from the safety mesh I stripped from the machinery deck railing. It hung below the grapple like a trawler's net. I positioned the crane. I started the swing. Left, right, stop. The grapple swung toward the Vanguard tower. It missed the balcony rail by 10 feet. Left, right, stop. The arc increased. The cable hummed. The tower groaned under the dynamic side load, protesting the abuse. "Come on," I whispered, my hand sweating on the joystick.
I had re-engaged the electrics for this operation, running off the last battery reserves. If I failed, I would not have the power to try again. Swing! The grapple smashed into the 48th floor window. Glass shattered, cascading down the side of the building like a diamond waterfall. The grapple swung inside the apartment. I killed the swing. The cable hit the top of the window frame. The grapple dragged across the floor of the luxury kitchen. I could not see exactly what I was grabbing. I just watched the cable tension. I trolleyed in, dragging the claw back toward the window. It caught on something. The tension spiked. 0.5 tons. Do not be the island. Do not be the island. I pulled. A massive stainless steel object crashed through the broken window frame. The refrigerator. It dangled in the air, held by the wrench claws and the tangle of the net. The doors flapped open. Items rained out. A carton of milk exploded on the balcony below. A jar of pickles plummeted to the street. No, no, no! But the freezer drawer, the bottom freezer drawer, was jammed shut. I hauled the load in. I brought it to the machinery deck, lowering it gently until it crashed onto the grating. I scrambled out of the cab. The freezer drawer was a treasure chest. 2 bags of frozen shrimp, thawed and refrozen, likely bad. A tub of gourmet ice cream, turned to soup, then refrozen. 3 ribeye steaks, vacuum sealed. A bag of frozen broccoli. And deep in the back, a solid block of ice that contained a plastic bag. I took the steaks. They were gray, but the vacuum seal was tight. No air, no bacteria. That night I cooked a ribeye on the top of the grease keg stove. I seared it on the hot steel. The smell of rendering beef fat was so intense, so overpowering, that I hallucinated. I heard voices. I heard a dinner party. I ate it with my hands, grease running down my chin, weeping silently. It was the best meal of my life. It tasted of iron and survival. Spring did not arrive with birdsong. It arrived with the sound of cracking ice. The sun angle changed. The light stayed longer. The white rivers below turned to gray slush, revealing the rusting carapaces of the gridlock. I watched the city thaw. The bodies that had been frozen in the snowdrifts emerged. They were preserved, horrific statues of the moment they died. Then, as the temperature rose, they began to rot. The smell hit the cab altitude a week later. It was a sweet, cloying stench that permeated the foam walls. I burned the stove hotter just to mask it with the smell of oil. But with the thaw came the movement. The herds below began to migrate. I watched them from my glass perch. They moved like fluids, following the path of least resistance. Thousands of them. They flowed down the avenues, swirling around the intersections. I started mapping them. I used a grease pencil on the glass walls of the cab.
Sector 4. High density, northward flow. Sector 1. Clear. I was not just surviving anymore. I was the lighthouse keeper. I was the traffic reporter for the end of the world. I realized then that I was not going to leave. The thought had been there in the beginning,
The idea of climbing down, fighting my way to the harbor, finding a boat. But looking at the sea of gray flesh moving through the streets, I understood the math. I had heat. I had water. I had a fishing pole that could reach 500 feet. I had a fortress in the sky. If I went down there, I was just another calorie. Up here, I was a god. I developed a relationship with the crane. I stopped calling it the machine and started calling her Bertha, after my grandmother who smoked 3 packs a day. Bertha was cranky. Her joints ached in the cold. Her fluids were thick. But she looked out for me. I spent my days cleaning her. I used rags to wipe down the console. I polished the glass. I greased the door hinges with the hydraulic fluid. One afternoon, in late April, the static on the radio changed. I kept the site radio on, volume low, just in case. It had been nothing but white noise for 4 months. But on that Tuesday, the static broke. "Any station, this is point relay." I froze. I dropped the piece of dried beef I was chewing. I scrambled for the mic. "Station calling. This is Tower 1, Atlas Plaza. I hear you." Silence.
Then the static rolled back in. "Tower 1 receiving. Repeat. I am here." Nothing. I sat there for an hour, the mic clutched in my hand, sweating. It came again. Faint, ghostly. Moving north. Ice clear. Barge transport. It was not a conversation. It was a broadcast. A loop. I adjusted the squelch. I tuned the frequency. It was coming from the river. I grabbed the binoculars. I scanned the Hudson. The water was gray, churning with the spring runoff. There, miles away, near the George Washington Bridge, a shape on the water. A tugboat pushing a barge, smoke rising from its stack. They were moving north, away from the city. I keyed the mic. "Tugboat, this is the crane. Turn around. I'm here. I have a visual." They did not turn. They kept moving, a slow, steady crawl against the current. They were too far away. My handheld radio put out 5 watts. They were miles out of range. I watched them for an hour until they disappeared around the bend of the river. I lowered the binoculars. I should have felt devastated. I should have felt the crushing weight of abandonment. But I did not. I looked around my cab, my foam walls, my grease keg stove, my drying rack of beef jerky hanging from the ceiling, my map of the city drawn on the glass. I was safe. I was warm. I looked down at the trap door. The drum of oil was still there, guarding the gate. I realized I did not want to be on that barge.
They were going somewhere new, somewhere uncertain. They were running. I was done running. I picked up the grease pencil. On the glass facing the river, I drew a small boat. I marked the time and the date. April 14th. River traffic. Northbound. I sat back in my chair. The sun was setting, turning the sky a brilliant, bruised purple. The stove popped and hissed, a comforting, rhythmic sound. I checked the drip feed. Perfect flow. I checked the water bottles. Full. I looked out at the city. My city. It was dead, yes. But it was quiet. And from up here, it was beautiful. Tower 1, I whispered to the empty air. Station is secure. I took a bite of the beef. It was tough, salty,
and tasted like victory. I was not waiting for a rescue anymore. I was just working the shift. And the shift never ended.